Hello and welcome back to the second season of the EduPulse podcast. Feel free to sit back and enjoy our conversations with leading educational thinkers, movers and shakers with a keen focus on helping our ITT and ECT colleagues navigate the choppy waters of education. Good evening everybody, is it Monday? I think it's Monday. Welcome to EduPulse Live. We are... Well, it's our podcast, but Adam and I once discovered that we could go live. And so that's what we do sometimes. And lots of people turn up. So welcome. Yeah, this is EduPulse Podcast Live. It's a Monday. Some of us have been getting back from work, shoving a pizza in our mouths, setting up a podcast to speak to the absolutely legendary Christopher Such. Chris, I mean, I've used your full name like you were in trouble then. You aren't. Welcome to the EduPulse Podcast.
You'll be relieved to know.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd gone full Christopher Michael Such, then I would have really felt my mum breathing down my neck. But no, yeah, Christopher, I don't have a preference. It's all the same to me. But yeah, lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to come on and chat about education.
We are just so delighted you're on, and so soon as well after the release of your incredible book. Got it here. It might be backwards for people who are watching live at home. Primary Reading Simplified. I mean, it's not a book you read, it's a book that reads you. You go it like it's mind-blowing. All of the questions on the pages, so the chapters are quite short, they're really digestible. The questions that you ask as chapter headings are the questions you're asking as a teacher, and then it's backed with evidence, little cheeky retrieval questions in there as well. It's referenced, it's evidence informed. It's absolutely amazing. So from us to you, thank you and congratulations. How has the launch gone? How are you feeling about it, and where has it gone in the world?
I'm pretty positive about it. People have been very nice so far, which is easier to do when they haven't read the book yet. You know, it's just general enthusiasm at this point, which is lovely. It crept into the top 100 of books on Amazon for a day or two, which was nice. I don't think that means an awful lot, though. I think it literally means that you sold a couple of 100 copies each day or something. But it made me feel quite good about myself. So that was lovely. Yeah, everyone's just been very nice about it so far, with an emphasis on so far. I say it all the time. I just hope it's useful. That's it. If it proves useful, then I'm delighted.
I mean, from my point of view, I am semi-primary based. We have year 5 and 6 at my school, but Adam is completely primary based. So I'm hoping he's either got a copy of this little Bible or it's going to be on its way. Do you know what? As well, it feels decent. It feels heavy. It's not something that could have been a blog post. This is meaty. It wouldn't quite stop a fire door, which is my kind of metric of whether it's too much or not. But for a book that, as if you're an experienced practitioner, you could dip into, but if you're starting out, you can start at page 1 and kind of move on from there. Before we kind of get into any of our questions, do you think it's a prerequisite to have read your first book before this one? I saw you comment online the other day that because somebody said, "Oh, I loved your first book. Should I get the second one?" Your comment was, "Far and away, this is above and beyond the first book I wrote. It's far more practical. It's far more insightful." Is that some of the feedback you're getting from people?
Yeah, so far people have been really positive about partly the structure you've described as well. I mean, I basically stole an idea from brilliant blogger, a maths secondary blogger called Michael Persson in America. I read a few of his blogs, which were all about teaching number bonds and multiplication facts. And he structured the blog as, these are the questions everyone wants the answers to. So that's how I'm going to, rather than just have, sections, every section is going to be a question. And I found it really compulsive reading as a result and really useful. So I stole that structure from him. I haven't even told him I've done this yet, but it seemed to just fit the book. You mentioned before about its length and how it isn't, it wasn't something that could have been a blog post. Initially, when I started writing this, in the back of my mind, I thought okay, if this is less than 20,000 words, I'll make it a series of blog posts. But it ended up being something like 85,000 words. In terms of whether people need to have read the first one, it's absolutely designed to work as a standalone thing. In fact, the first couple of chapters are a bit of a previously on whatever. It kind of brings people up to speed with the things that I tried to express in the first book. To be blunt, the first book was really just me trying to take the contents of my head about reading research and get it down somewhere. So I didn't have to feel like I was carrying it around anymore. Whereas, and the thought was that teachers might find this useful. School leaders might find this useful. This is the stuff that I think they need to know if they're going to make evidence-informed decisions about reading. In contrast, this book started from a position of how can I help schools to make what I think are really good decisions about every aspect of reading. So it was kind of practicalities first. The one thing I would say about the link between the two books, I don't think I would have dared to have written this one if I hadn't first written something that at least attempts to suggest to an audience that I maybe know what I'm talking about. And equally, I wouldn't have dared write the second one if I hadn't spent the last 2 or 3 years working with lots and lots of schools, actually trying to help them to change how they teach reading. And it's kind of that inspired the book. With any luck, this new book will put me out of business as a consultant, because no one will ask me into schools anymore. No one will ask me to come and speak about X, Y, and Z, because they'll just have read the book, and I will then be useless as a consultant, and I can go back to hopefully being useful as a classroom teacher.
It really is amazing. My second, well, your second book my copy of it hasn't arrived yet, but I'm eagerly awaiting it, having read the first one. When I read the first one, it was a real penny drop moment for me, just pulling everything. You just pull everything together so well in that first one. And also what I like about it as well is that you kind of you suggest the way that you would apply it, and you would apply all of the science of reading, but you don't insist that everybody else does it exactly that same way, which I just love the way that comes across, because so often we kind of don't get that agency as school leaders to kind of apply the knowledge, which you give us license to do that, which is brilliant.
And precisely with this second book, I'm a bit more forward. I'm a bit more, this is how I would go about doing X, Y, and Z. But for every part of the book and every chapter, etc., it really begins with shared understanding of the principles behind it. So when I talk about, for example, what I call reading lesson structures, which is an unnecessarily fancy way to talk about different ways of conducting a reading lesson to meet the different priorities that I think need to be addressed. When I'm doing that, I'm not, what's the phrase I'm looking for? I'm starting off with the principles. I'm starting off by saying, this is what you need to achieve. And there are loads of ways to achieve that. And one way is what I'm about to describe in detail. And even if schools come away from the book going, okay, I don't want to do it in exactly that way, maybe I don't think it would fit for our context, etc., I still think there's a ton to take away from it, just seeing the principles and then a relatively tried and tested approach described in detail.
Yeah, and a concrete example there of how those principles could actually be applied, which is, for anybody that's listening that hasn't come across Chris's work before, or if you haven't tried to put Chris's work into practice, if you're a primary teacher, absolutely do it. Don't hesitate. When I joined my current school, it was one of the first things that I did with the reading lead, was start to put Chris's work into practice, and honestly, the school has just not looked back ever since. It's been absolutely brilliant. So absolutely hats off to you. Should we dive in with a big question? Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so let's go straight away then with what's wrong with the status quo in how reading is taught in schools across England? Big question.
So first thing to say about what I think of the status quo is that I haven't done an authoritative survey of every school. I haven't got a crystal ball, but I have spent a lot of time over the last decade talking specifically about reading with lots and lots of teachers across England and more broadly across the English-speaking world. I've worked with lots of schools. etc. And so, just going to pause a second. I've got a.
It came back. Yeah, it's my internet.
Sorry, apologies. No, it was really hard hearing my own voice. My apologies.
No.
No, sorry about that. So where was I? Oh yeah, so status quo of I think I'm fairly well positioned to have a pretty good grasp of what the broader patterns are when it comes to the teaching of reading. But caveat, I haven't done an authoritative survey, so it is, just what I think about this stuff. And before I talk about kind of this broader status quo, it's also worth noting that there are, of course, pockets of practice that don't fit into this status quo, either because there are schools doing things that are just a bit surprising and a bit odd that I've never seen before, or I've only seen once, or some schools just doing really brilliant evidence-informed things that I just wouldn't think about touching because it's just magical as it stands. But the wider pattern across England, I think, can be summed up with two approaches. The first is carousel-guided reading, which is decreasing in popularity. I would say maybe 10-20% of schools, from my experience, are still using this kind of method of teaching reading. For those who aren't familiar with it, basic idea is that kids are sat into groups, usually based on attainment. The teacher works with one group, and the other kids are left to get on with a reading-related activity in the hope that they will progress in their reading independently, and that the kind of focused attention that you give on one group makes up for all the time that you're not spending with the rest. I taught that way for a long time at the start of my career, at least a few years in different year groups. I kind of liked it in some way. I enjoyed the conversations, especially when I was working with the stronger readers. But I always had this strong suspicion that the weaker readers, if not the vast majority of the class, were just being let down because it was a deeply inefficient way to teach, at least when I did it and where I've observed other people doing it. But that's kind of faded out over time and has been replaced by the teaching of comprehension skills. It's been replaced by schools mainly teaching whole class reading, which I think as a default jumping off point is a good place to be when we're teaching anything. Teaching as many pupils at the same time as we possibly can is, a good starting point. But it's been attached to this misconception, this idea that we don't really need to teach pupils to develop their reading fluency, and we don't need to broaden their knowledge and deepen their knowledge of written language and the world that it represents in a really thoughtful manner through the texts that we choose. We don't need to give them meaningful experiences. What we really need to do, and it's possibly all we need to do, is we need to make sure that we teach them how to answer different categories of questions. When researchers talk about comprehension skills, they're using it in a really loose, a really broad way. You can say a kid's learned 5 words and they'll say they've developed their vocabulary skills. But they really, researchers mean skills in terms of anything relating to capabilities. But invariably, you ask teachers about comprehension skills, and it comes back to how to answer inference questions, as they call it, how to answer summarizing questions, etc. And it sounds like a glorious shortcut, doesn't it? Forget all of this really difficult work building pupils as fluent readers. Forget your reading curriculum and meaningful experiences with texts and trying to build up this vast array of understanding about written language that capable, confident readers develop. Forget about all that. We can take a shortcut to teaching them how to answer certain kinds of questions, and then they'll be able to answer whatever question they're faced with, regardless of the text. And it sounds too good to be true because it is. It's a completely bogus way to think about the teaching of comprehension. It is thinking skills, but applied to, or the kind of underpinning logic of thinking skills applied unthinkingly, ironically, to the subject of reading. And it has major consequences. I know I've talked for a long time now. I'll just take another 30 seconds.
I could listen to this all day. You keep going.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so the consequences of this misconception that have come about by people interpreting the content domains from the Key Stage 2 SATs and assuming that those content domains, the different kinds of questions, that they are real and important things rather than just an arbitrary way to divide up questions so that you can keep an assessment consistent. People have looked at those and gone, these are the skills we need to teach. And the consequence of this has been really damaging in most cases. What it's led to is lessons that often involve very little text. I've lost count of the number of schools where their reading week involves the pupils maybe reading a 250-word text on a Monday and then engaging with the same text again on the Tuesday, the Wednesday, the Thursday, and the Friday, and each time looking at a different kind of question, looking at inference questions or prediction questions or summarizing questions. So it limits the amount of text that pupils are engaged with. It stops schools as a result from developing pupils as fluent readers. It means often that schools are providing kids just with fairly random, disconnected extracts rather than meaningful experiences with text. So when I say meaningful, I mean reading for the purpose that the author intended. You know, a poem because you want to be moved by it, a story because you want to get engaged in a fictional world, etc. Kids are robbed of these experiences, of meaningful experiences of texts. And even when schools do dive into deeper bits of discussion, they're so focused on SATs outcomes, or SAT-style questions, I should say, that it doesn't, the questions they ask don't ask kids about their subjective views or connections they've made or what the text, you know, meant to them, what they like, what they didn't like, or even things like, well, what questions do you have? Because that sort of stuff doesn't align particularly well with SATs. And the great irony of this is that this desperate attempt to fit teaching to align with the SATs, I think, is arguably the number one thing you can do to weaken your SATs results. Because ultimately, kids who do well in SATs are those who are fluent readers, who know loads about written language and the world that it represents. And how do you get there? Well, you do things that build fluency. You read a ton, ideally meaningful experiences, so kids are getting engaged by all this. But also, through this, you build up their understanding of written language and the wider world. And so, yeah, we've ended up trying to achieve something and achieving the polar opposite, as well as a load of unfortunate consequences that have come along with it.
I think there's a couple of really important things in there. So, like, firstly, just as a absolute proof of concept here, for the last 2 years in my school, we've mandated, not mandated, but we said there is no need at all to write anything in a reading lesson. If you get through the entire year and your kids haven't written anything in a reading lesson, we are absolutely all right with that. And definitely what we don't want to see is lessons where you're teaching kids how to answer certain questions. In year 6, they have like 1 20-minute session a week where they look at like a question type and how to answer it. But the rest of the time, it is just, it's your book, essentially. And 2 years ago, we were in the top 1% of schools in the country for outcomes, for combined outcomes. And we had like 97% of kids getting expected, 72% getting greater depth. Last year, we dipped down to 93% expected and like 64% greater depth or something. It's absolutely tried and tested. And honestly, that is every teacher across the school being told you do not need to write stuff down in reading lessons at all. I think there's some really clear reasons though as to why like people maybe are reluctant to get on this bandwagon as well. And I think some of that is because it's really like seductively concrete. Both of those approaches that you talk about there. So like if you take carousel guided reading, I remember being a teacher right at the beginning of my career and thinking, this doesn't feel right. Like on all of the days, it didn't feel right. But then I'd sort of do the maths and I'd think, well, okay, so that group is only getting 1 day where it feels like it's having any impact out of 5, but there's 5 times fewer pupils in that group. So that probably those two things outweigh each other mathematically, and it's exactly the same as if I was teaching all 30 for 5 days. And so that sort of mathematical equation is quite seductive. And the same thing with comprehension skills as well. Like when you look at the content domains of the SATs and you go, well, they've organized the questions in this way. That must mean that that's how reading is organized. So if I teach reading the way that it's apparently organized, they're going to do really well. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that like if you're still not sure, like firstly, don't worry about that because it is, like I say, both of those approaches, carousel guided reading and comprehension skill teaching, are really seductive, and it's easy to kind of it's easy to go down those routes unknowingly. And secondly, give it a go because you will not be disappointed because we've got proof of concept right here.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about reading in particular, even though like quietly I like maths teaching at least as much as teaching reading. The reason why I got so absorbed by this was that the more I spoke to schools and teachers and the more I read around it, the more it felt like, and this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I stand by it. I think it is the low-hanging fruit of the entirety of our education system, in that the most important thing, arguably, that we teach, other than, you know, personal values and making sure that kids are safe, etc., the most important thing that we do in schools is teach them how to read. And currently, most schools are doing that in a way that doesn't involve much reading. And they're then surprised that, you know, reading results aren't necessarily what they might be. And thinking equally about the work that's been done over the last decade to ensure that the vast majority of schools are getting pupils to that early stage of reading development through phonics. So they're teaching systematic synthetic phonics. They're getting pupils to the point where they can begin to decode words for themselves, and basically laying really solid foundations. And then schools are building nothing on top in a lot of cases, because the whole point of phonics is that you're giving kids the capability to begin their journey to reading fluency. They can begin to understand more and more about the English writing system, excuse me, through their text experience. And at first, that needs to be scaffolded quite a lot, because they're going to struggle with decoding, etc. But over time, it will become more and more second nature. But if they're not, to put it bluntly, inputting all of this data about written language, then they are not developing as fluent readers. You've taught them phonics and initial decoding almost for no purpose, because the whole point of it, as I say, is to allow them to begin that journey to fluency. I think there's been some miscommunicated messages, not least from previous Department for Education, around what phonics is. There was this idea, if a kid is struggling with reading in any form, it must mean they need more phonics, because you teach phonics until kids are fluent. And that's just not what phonics has ever been designed for. The purpose of phonics is to teach pupils enough so that they can begin to recognize words for themselves. And then that journey to fluency begins through tons and tons of reading experience, plenty of it requiring scaffolding. So yeah, just if I may pick up on one other thing you mentioned there as well. You talked about writing, and you're dead right. Like the approach that I advocate minimizes writing in reading lessons. There's still a little bit in close reading lessons, for example, where appropriate. I've got no problem with schools saying, well, actually, we do want pupils to respond in writing. I do as well. I think it's really important that across the school curriculum, pupils are writing in response to text, and also reading things that are going to inform, you know, the creative sides of their writing. I think that really matters. But the vast majority of schools have 50 minutes to an hour a day on English or writing, and then there's writing across the rest of the curriculum. And then they maybe have 20 to 30 minutes a day on reading. And then that's, you know, most of that time is often taken up by writing as well. So you end up not feeding this underlying reading capability and thus language knowledge that will actually support writing anyway. So if a school, say, did have an hour of reading per day and 30 minutes on writing as their balance in English, I would be perfectly happy to say, oh yeah, you might want to do quite a lot of writing in response to text in your reading lessons, because you might not have room for it elsewhere. But given the balance that exists in the timetables of almost every primary school I've come across, it makes much more sense to write in response to text, to integrate those two things in the other parts of our curriculum, be it English or science, geography, history, etc., rather than that relatively brief time that we allot to reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's a case there as well for, maybe this is another book you could write, which would be amazing. I'd read it, around reading across the curriculum, like specifically reading across the curriculum. And, you know, what does reading in geography look like? What does reading in science look like? And how do we get kids to respond thoughtfully in those subjects as well?
Well, I dare say there is a chapter in the new book on that very subject, though I'm wary of going too far into what's sometimes described as like disciplinary reading or disciplinary literacy. I think it's possible for schools to get kind of quite absorbed in kind of niche aspects of teaching reading around that. For me, as long as kids are having opportunities to do some reading in your points in your science, geography, history, it doesn't have to be every lesson. It doesn't have to be just tacked on. As long as there is some purposeful reading across the curriculum, I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, that's reassuring as well, isn't it? I suppose that a question that I think like I would love to ask, and I'd actually love to ask Chris Passy this as well,
Oh,
actually,
the other Chris.
is if you think about like reading outcomes, we talk a lot about outcomes, don't we? Particularly, well, in primary school, we talk about them a lot within the context of reading. We talk about reading outcomes all the time. And I've just told you about our reading outcomes in terms of our exam outcomes, right? But I think some of the time it's one of the biggest problems that we have is that we only think about outcomes being an exam outcome. Whereas actually like the more powerful outcomes that I think a lot of us would actually hand on heart say we care about the most are social outcomes, intellectual outcomes of the subjects that we teach. So, and I know, Chris Passy, to keep calling you Chris Passy now on this one. Chris Passy is an English teacher by trade and is an English fanatic. If I was to ask you what the ideal outcome is for you of the children in your school and the reading curriculum that they have, what would that outcome be?
Yeah, thank you for that rather small question that we're just gonna put out there.
Unplanned as well.
Yeah, for context, Chris, my school is a very small independent music specialist school. We have a lot of young people coming to us who might have been out of school for many years. The system doesn't quite work. You'll have a year 10 turn up that isn't confident in reading and as such has such a lack of comprehension they hate the lesson. And then you have a conversation of do you put them in for English literature or do you just put them in for English language because they need a GCSE, so what do you do? And then all of a sudden you're teaching to test. And I'm quite evangelical in the fact that I believe the teaching and the learning of English can genuinely make the world a better place. I believe we are better human beings and better people for the empathy we can gain through reading by taking on other worlds, reading not just for pleasure, what on earth that phrase means, but kind of reading for displeasure as well, reading for discomfort, reading about bad things, good things. So it's odd. I've got a A-level English language student who is the living embodiment of she reads 17 books a month kind of thing. I'm joking. That's obviously far too much. She's read her entire life. I believe her house is basically a library. And to have an English literature or language conversation with her is so mind-blowingly refreshing about what it can actually do if reading is taught from the get-go. It's you literally stop speaking because you can bring something in. So I brought in a bit of A-level language. We were looking at prototypicality of things. So for non-English people out there, a robin is more prototypical of a bird than a penguin is, but they're still birds kind of thing. So just talking about prototypicality of creating worlds. And I only had to say that one thing and she was off. She went, oh yeah, well, because in the opening paragraph of The Handmaid's Tale, which is one of the books she's studying, and then this, and I guess the language used about the mowing the lawn, that eases the audience into, like, she's 15 pages ahead of the textbook. And I'm like, where are you getting this from? And I guess that's partly it, such, that I'm flying that flag, but sometimes you find yourself in a position where we've missed those key phonic inputs. They're 13, 14. They've got bad experience of school. And we've recently had 2 inspections from the old bill, and one where they were really going hard about reading for pleasure. And we had quite a strong conversation over what on earth do you mean by that? And they couldn't give me a straight answer because I think it's a nonsense phrase. I think it's a destructive phrase. I don't think it means anything in particular. The inspector was like, well, it means that they enjoy reading. Like, who enjoys reading? I mean, they're teenagers. Like, is it manga? Are they reading the instructions on their Fortnite game? I don't know. But reading for pleasure isn't what we've got here. But then when we were re-inspected, the inspector was like, oh, but they read a lot of different books. There's a lot of fiction. There's a lot of non-fiction. There's a lot of speeches. And we spend our time sometimes just reading the book, and then we go, that was fun, wasn't it? Wait, we're not going to write an essay? No, that was just a good time. And so my outcome is then in the young people that are coming out of our school. Adam has, I think, been lucky enough to meet some of those people. And the way they are able to stand on their own 2 feet, look somebody in the eye, shake their hand, talk to them fluently and calmly, I actually selfishly believe comes from a little bit of how we teach English. It's a cultural thing, obviously, but I really believe that if you can speak to a section of a book and the kids don't go, oh, well, God, why is the curtain blue and velvet. But if a person can go, if they can go, oh, that's possibly because the authors are using a metaphor here that we haven't quite considered. I believe we're teaching them a skill that is deeply important in a world that they're being spat out into that is not empathetic at all. And those would be my outcomes. They are highfalutin, they are naive, they are aspirational, but I think they're inspirational, and is what I stand by, because as an independent school, data isn't something that we necessarily stress over. It's not something we have to give. We've only got 60 kids in the school. Data at that point is statistically insignificant. Like, that kid has done really well because they've come into school for the first time in 6 months and they've read a book. 100% well done. You can't do it in terms of GLD, etc. But this kind of thing, being able to give this to my primary phase and back channel some of the theory, back channel some of this is where some of our kids may have come from, means that they are able to read your book and potentially access thoughts that I'm not able to give them because we're running a small school and the head teacher's got a broom in her hand and we're fixing a pipe, and Macbeth's got to be taught in year 10, and off you go. It's a very long answer, and I apologise to watchers and listeners, but Adam pressed a button and he knew that might happen. So the accusatory fingers come out. You set me off. Anything I've said there, Chris, that you think you might want to agree or disagree with?
I mean, I think to get to the heart of what you're saying there. I mean, there is ultimately these two sides to outcomes when it comes to the teaching of reading. There's this functional side of things, which is, there's probably no capability that we pass from generation to generation that is as important or as transformational as reading, beyond learning to speak, learning to walk, those kind of basic, like really basic ideas. And these things are things that come quite naturally to pupils. Of all the things that we actually need teachers for, reading is arguably as important as it gets. And there's, like I say, there's this functional element to it. Often people will say to me, well, I'm working with this pupil and they're in year 12 and I'm not sure about what's the purpose of us going back to phonics, because I don't see in the time that we've got that this pupil is going to leave our school as a really fluent reader who's going to love reading. It's like, well, maybe, firstly, don't write that off as a possibility, depending on what's happened in their past. But equally, like, if you can't get that pupil to that perfect end state, a difference between someone who can and can't read the back of a medicine bottle, can and can't respond to an email from their child's school, or process the basics of a bill that's come through their door, that's massive. Even if they're, reading for pleasure is a very distant goal for these pupils. And arguably that smaller difference for that pupil is as big a difference as you can make for any pupil at any age. So there is this kind of functional, this is just a life skill that everyone really deserves the maximum chance of acquiring. But there's also that other side of things, which is, I think, a lot of what you spoke to there, which is about like a huge amount of the greatest works of art that have ever been created in human civilization are written down. And even when they haven't been written down in English, translations exist. You can find out about the greatest works of Dostoevsky and Chekhov or whoever it might be, and you can't access that if you can't read. And just being able to have that world of art open to you. Now, I'm not someone who necessarily thinks that a really brilliant book is necessarily better than a really brilliant film or a really brilliant piece of music or a really brilliant X, Y, and Z. But opening pupils' horizons, or broadening the horizons around the kind of wonderful works of art that exist, and just the joy of losing yourself in a story has to be something that is worth attempting to achieve. I sympathize with you when you talk about reading for pleasure there, because I often think that hidden within discussions of reading for pleasure is an underlying suggestion that as long as we get kids to love books, capability will take care of itself. And that is just so fundamentally not true. And anyone who has worked with struggling readers in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and I did briefly in Key Stage 3, anyone who's done that will tell you that just isn't true for lots and lots of kids. If you don't accept that there's a proportion of children for whom learning to read is going to be a pain in the neck, is going to take real effort and guts to get there, then you're letting these kids down. Yes, the end game for them can still very often be joy in reading, or reading because they are able to find out things that they wouldn't do otherwise, etc. But yes, sometimes I do think when people talk about reading for pleasure, there is an agenda behind it. And what I mean by that is the most common, if you ask me, the number one question I get asked when I work with schools, the number one question I get asked that includes the phrase reading for pleasure is, do you think phonics has impacted reading for pleasure? Or do you think that trying to teach pupils to be fluent readers has impacted reading for pleasure? Basically, it's like, aren't we stopping pupils from loving reading if we try and teach reading? I mean, the great irony of all this stuff is that so often I go into schools who will have various initiatives in place, often ones that take a lot of teachers' time in order to develop reading for pleasure. And lots of them, you think, wow, that does look great. That does look great. But then you find out about their reading lessons and you think, this doesn't marry up at all. You're not supporting pupils to become capable readers. And even if you were doing that, your reading lessons don't give kids the sense that reading is purposeful, that we read stories to get lost in a narrative world, that we read poems to be moved, that we can read newspaper articles to find out about events. It's always, how do I answer questions related to this text? And if that's always what you're doing, and if that's how your reading lessons are structured, then the idea that pupils are going to potentially start to want to do independent reading, I think that's a bit of a non-starter.
Can I just jump in there very quickly, because you've actually just stumbled on our next question beautifully, I might add. But something happened to me when I was in year 6, which sits with me as a deeply disappointing moment, which I think speaks to what you just said. I always wanted to play the recorder. And I picked up my first recorder in year 6. And inside remember though, they came in those corduroy yellow thin sock bags, didn't they, with a red string at the top, and you and a stick that you thought was the conducting stick, but you didn't realise you had to stick it up the end. And this is interesting when it goes into a normal podcast. Dear non-visual listener, I'm shoving a oh, it doesn't really matter, does it? Either way, when the recorder came out, there was a slip of music that was attached. I now know that to be a scale. I didn't then. And do you know what I did? I put that piece of paper on the table, I picked up my recorder, and I tried to play what was there. Because I loved music. I loved it so much, but I couldn't decode what was in front of me. I had no idea what it was. So my love of the idea of music fed I'm going to pick up this, let's move over. I'm going to pick up this book. Oh, I love it. And I just opened it and I was like, I have no idea what any of this is. And I did the reading equivalent of blah, 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 blah. I had no clue. My recorder must have sounded like 1,000 sparrows dying. But what you just said then really just sparked that memory of, just because I loved it didn't mean it gave me the tools to read what was in front of me.
And dare I say, often you can end up with a quite almost toxic relationship with it when pupils are so desperate. They've got this sense of, I know that reading is wonderful and often easy for my friends, etc. And there is this implication in my school that as long as I love it enough, and if I want it enough, I will just be a reader. Like I can't think of anything that's going to be more damaging to someone who might struggle to learn and might need to go through a longer, more difficult journey to become a reader than that kind of implication. And yet often it kind of underwrites a lot of the way that people talk about reading. I think it is, like, to play devil's advocate here, or not even devil's advocate, I do think there are some wonderful resources out there that are related to, reading for pleasure. So the Open University has some wonderful stuff and some wonderful people that they've worked with. And so often, as an umbrella term, there is some really good stuff that comes about through this side of things. And equally, if we aren't thinking about whether experiences of reading in school are potentially meaningful, pleasurable, engaging, moving, or even, like you say, saddening, if you're reading a story that might do that, but basically aren't connecting with pupils, then yeah, we're obviously doing the teaching of reading a disservice. And the challenge there is, how do we engage pupils with those kind of experiences before they can maybe love reading like completely independently? And a lot of that comes down to reading aloud. A lot of that comes down to shared experiences of reading. But yeah, I don't think we can forget about that. There is always an element of, let's show pupils what they're aiming for over the longer term. Let's show the meaningful experiences and potentially even, yes, the pleasurable, joyful experiences that you can have from reading, so that there is this incentive to get there.
But I think with there though, you're what are you showing them? You're showing them the meaning. You're showing them purpose. You're showing them proficiency and competence in something, and all of those things are enjoyable. So if we're talking about reading for pleasure and reading for enjoyment, if we give them all of those things, the pleasure and the enjoyment will absolutely come. But like you say, the absolute key part of that is the competence of actually being able to read. Otherwise, we're not going to get to enjoyment until you get to that stage, until you kind of go through that threshold. The same with anything. It's the same with a sport, any kind, or music. In fact, if I tried to pick up that recorder, I'd be exactly the same right now. And if I didn't kind of start getting incrementally better at it, I wouldn't enjoy it, and I'd essentially give up.
Yeah, there's an element with this as well that we often talk about, reading for pleasure, and there's this assumption that the kind of joy and excitement is the only sort of kind of, if you like, pleasure that we should be aiming for. If I think about my favorite experiences of supporting struggling readers in particular, it's when they first start to develop that sense of satisfaction about, can I actually do this? It's slow and it's difficult. And often that sense of satisfaction is coming even when it is still slow and difficult and stop-start. But just that sense of, okay, this thing was incomprehensible to me 6 months ago. And now, it's a bit like someone's talking to me. Goodness, that kind of, and you wouldn't necessarily talk about that as pleasure in the usual terms, because we're not at that point talking about them getting lost in a story or whatever it might be. At that point, we are talking about just like the satisfaction of being able to do something capably and seeing your own progress at it. I think that is as much a driving factor in reading development as what we might more traditionally think of as reading for pleasure, which is more, getting lost in a story or finding out something exciting from a newspaper article or whatever it might be.
That's brilliant. Really, I mean, that's the headline there. Then, reading for pleasure is more than just one thing. If we can get meaning, purpose, like the social impact of high quality reading instruction, will just go on and on and on. Okay, so how do we get good at doing that then in classrooms? What are the reading lesson structures that you talk about in the book? What's the thinking behind them, and how do we do it? Tell us what to do, Chris.
So it would be really convenient if I could say right now and be honest and say, the only way to teach reading that I think is effective and evidence-informed is what I describe in my book, but I can't say that honestly because it's just not true. There are a whole variety of ways that you could organise the teaching of reading in an effective, evidence-informed manner, in a way, bluntly, that I'd go into your school, I'd look at that reading and say, well, that's not how I would do it probably, but I wouldn't touch it. It looks great. It's doing all the things you need to achieve. But to my mind, based on what I've read and what I've seen and the conversations I've had over the past decade or so, I do think that there are a set of fairly basic principles that we need to bear in mind if we're going to construct a way of teaching reading that's going to work. The first is that when I talk about teaching reading here, I'm thinking beyond the teaching of phonics. Let's take that as a given. Yeah. High quality teaching of phonics is a given. Let's take things like developing pupils' spoken language capabilities, because that's really important to this as well, across the curriculum. Let's take that as a given as well. Things like teaching of spelling. If we're talking about reading lessons post phonics, I think basically there are three things you have to do. The first is you have to make sure that you are providing pupils with the scaffolded decoding practice required to help them begin their journey to reading fluency, and then the mountains of decoding practice that follows that continues that journey. So developing fluency through decoding practice. The second thing you need to do is you need to be giving pupils loads of meaningful experiences with texts in order to build up their understanding of written language and the wider world that it relates to. The third thing you need to do is you need to be engaging pupils in deeper text discussions so that you can talk about the craft of writing, so that you can nudge pupils to be more strategic with texts that they're finding more difficult, and really importantly, so you can start to support them to develop their own identity as readers. Like, what do they like? What do they not like? How do they feel about a given text? What questions did they have about it? What confused them, etc. So, in short, 3 principles: develop fluency through decoding practice. Do a ton of reading, meaningful, pacey, engaging experiences with books and other kinds of texts, and deeper discussions of texts. Now, my way of addressing those 3 principles, as I said before, not the only way, but a tried and tested way that I've used myself, that a school I've worked with have used, and hundreds of schools that I've now supported now continue to use, is to say, well, let's have a different way of teaching reading, or a different reading lesson structure for each of those 3 priorities. So for fluency, to develop fluency, there's a fluency read, which is basically repeated oral reading. Teacher models a relatively short text. Pupils rehearse it until 3 or 4 times to develop a sense of fluency. Then there's a little bit of performance and discussion. So something that comes directly from the research and successful schools that do this sort of thing. Then, in order to develop this breadth of reading, that second priority, there's extended reading, which is basically a fancy version of story time. The teacher takes charge, reads aloud while pupils listen. There's pauses occasionally to explain things and to ask pupils the odd question to make sure they're making sense of text. It's a more accountable form of story time, if you like. Though I would also, by the way, still have story time, just because it's a lovely thing in the school day. I'd still have that separate. But that extended reading, make sure pupils, through their time in your school, experience 30 or 40 wonderful storybooks and other kinds of texts that you've chosen for that purpose. But also what you can start to do is incrementally introduce independent reading into that. So pupils more and more are being required to do a chunk of silent reading and then respond to it. And over time, you're building that up. So you're not leaving the development of reading stamina to chance. You are intentionally developing it step by step. And then close reading addresses that third priority, which is to have deeper discussions about texts, about the craft of writing, and about pupils' subjective experiences with texts. It's kind of the opposite of extended reading, which is all about pace and getting lost in a book. This is, well, let's slow down, let's go back to something maybe we finished previously, and let's dive into it. Let's look at how the author made us laugh, or how they built tension in this way, or what this part of the text made us feel, or how did this character develop, and what does that tell us about the nature of storytelling, whatever it might be. So those 3 priorities I address with 3 different reading lesson structures. And the reason I do that, and the reason I think it's why schools like it, in part, is because you guarantee that you're addressing those priorities. You can change the proportions of those reading lesson structures to meet the needs of your class. Year 2, for example, tend to need far more scaffolded decoding practice than Year 6. So you can have more fluency reading and then more close reading as they move through school, replacing it. But crucially as well, it's a really practicable way to learn how to teach reading. Whether you're on your own or you're rolling this out across a school, you can take it a piece at a time. This thing that otherwise might seem quite complex can be learned in relatively simple chunks. I'm just going to take a few weeks to learn how to get comfortable with a fluency reading lesson. And once me and my class are really comfortable with those routines, then we'll think about learning how to do an extended reading lesson. And then the same thing down the line with the close reading. You can take it a piece at a time. All of this plays into the message that I put at the very beginning and the very end of my book, which is that any approach to teaching reading, and dare I say teaching anything actually, but any approach to teaching reading, it must be judged ultimately on whether it allows novice teachers to teach adequately, and if it allows relatively expert teachers to continue to develop and express themselves. And the thing about reading lesson structures is that I think there's loads of room for expert teachers to continue learning and getting better and developing their craft and actually personalizing how they teach these things. But there's enough shared structure there, and it's simple enough that an ECT can pick these up and deliver at least adequate reading experiences with the class that's in front of them. Because if you're not doing that, if you can't put something in place that allows novice teachers to teach adequately, then you are simply letting down the pupils in your school that inevitably will be taught at points by novice teachers.
What about, Chris, the like, to what extent would you use extracts, whole books that you've read? I know you just touched on a lot of that there as well, but just like really clearly, like to what extent would you use extracts, whole books that you've read previously, extracts from whole books that you've read previously? How does that fit into these lesson structures?
Good question. So for extended reading, which is the one where you're reading at pace, generally speaking, when I look back on my teaching, I tended to read somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 words per lesson. So for perspective, Fantastic Mr. Fox is 9,000 words. So you can read a book like that across 3 or 4 extended reading lessons. In extended reading lessons, we're picking up where we're left off and we're progressing through a book. Now, it might be a storybook, it might be a collection of information texts that we're really fascinated by. It might be a really long poem, depending, if you think about something like The Highwayman, you can read almost anything, but you're reading it in its entirety and you're progressing through it at pace. That's where I'm really engaging with entire texts. When it comes to fluency reading, I might use extracts, or I might use, say, relatively brief information texts. Maybe if I've got, say, 2 fluency reading lessons a week in year 3 or year 4, it might be that I've divided an information text from my history curriculum into 2 parts. For fluency reading, it's a relatively brief text that we're reading or chunk of text that we're reading that one time in that reading lesson before we go on to something else in our next fluency reading lesson. It could be an extract, but often I prefer relatively brief poems, information texts, newspaper articles, etc. For close reading, I think that the very best discussions you will have about texts, especially if you're thinking about an extract, is when that extract is something you've pulled out of a text that you've read in its entirety. How much more deep can the conversations be about, say, how an author introduces a character at the start of a story, if everyone in that discussion knows where that story is going, knows how the character changes, knows why the author might have portrayed them in this way, bearing in mind the events that come? How much deeper is the discussion of the writer's craft if you can put it in that sense? Now, this isn't to say that we should never use extracts. I think there can be value for comparison purposes, or just because there's a really wonderful story in your reading corner that you want to hook kids into, and you think, I'm just going to take a chunk of that, get them hooked in that book, and then just point them to the reading corner and say, there's 5 copies of that over there. So there are reasons why we might use extracts. But as a general rule, I do think there needs to be lots of genuine progression through entire texts as part of your reading curriculum as well. And that necessitates, or it doesn't quite necessitate it. I was about to say it necessitates whole sets of texts for your class so that everyone has a copy. It isn't completely necessary. You can teach the way I describe without entire sets of texts. But over the longer term, I can't see any reason whatsoever why a school wouldn't invest in class sets of texts for their reading curriculum, especially when you compare the cost of that investment and the impact of that investment to, say, a few iPads. You can kit out a school with all the books it's going to need for a decade for the cost of a few iPads. So, yeah, I do think the whole class sets of texts are really, really valuable so that you can have these meaningful experiences with entire texts, as well as diving into extracts, diving into poetry and other kinds of texts.
Well, what about, so we talked a little bit earlier about like whole class readers, so like your end of the day, or traditionally end of the day reading doesn't always have to be at the end of the day, can I just say, but like your traditional end of day reading, do those books, in your opinion, do they sit separately from the books that you're reading in your reading curriculum, or these extended reading books, is that the same text?
Good question. So there are lots of options here. So a school could say, actually, rather than having story time, we want to have more extended reading, and we're going to engage pupils in that way with it. They are getting meaningful experiences with entire texts, so we are achieving that purpose. I don't think that's problematic. Personally, I do think it's quite valuable to have a separate part of your day, even if it's just 10 minutes, which is purely dedicated to pleasure. Not least because there's something about hearing someone read a story aloud and knowing that they're not going to pause, and dare I say, even knowing that you can sort of drift off a little bit, you're paying attention to it, you're with the story, but if something comes up in a story, that reminds you of, that time your grandpa took you fishing, or whatever it might be, that you can have that momentary daydream and then come back into it, a much lower pressure way of engaging with stories. I think that's just quite a nice thing to have. And dare I say, if you do have this as a separate thing, you've then got this space for teachers to say, I know we've got this reading curriculum that we've chosen and all these wonderful books that guarantee pupils certain perspectives and certain experiences with language. We've got that set in stone, but there's still this space for me to say, for example, when I was in year 5, a teacher read Danny Champion of the World to me, and it meant something deep to me. And as a teacher, I'm now teaching year 5. I want to share that story. And just having that room to say to teachers, look, if you're passionate about a book and it's age appropriate, then read it to them. Yeah, go for it. I want there to be that balance between a reading curriculum that guarantees certain experiences for pupils and certain perspectives to pupils, and some scope for teachers to be able to say, like, for example, at story time, I love this book. It's going to blow your socks off. You're going to laugh like drains. Let's read it together. So, I think having both is ideal. I don't think it's problematic if you combine the two. The last thing, but I do tend to think it's a good idea to keep that story time book or shared reading, whatever you call it, a bit separate. That said, if you've read that whole story to kids and they loved it, and there was chunks of it. Let's say you read Who Let the Gods Out by Maz Evans, and there's 20 places in that book that just had kids rolling on the floor with laughter. Once you finish the book, why not go, you know what, there's a good couple of close reading lessons on this where we dive back into it and learn about how Maz Evans made us laugh, and maybe why Maz Evans made us laugh at these points in the story, so that we can better understand the craft of being a writer. So yeah, you can use it in that sense, but I do think there's some value in keeping them separate.
I've got to say, like, one of my strongest memories as a kid, little Mr. Smith in year 4 read us Pong Whiffy. I forget the author, but I know that
Classic.
That the hamster was from Hamsterdam, and it made me laugh. And I'm 38 now, so we're going back. That's a long time ago, and that memory, I can smell the classroom. I can see the teacher. We were all laughing. It was a moment. We were all sat down on the carpet. We were reading. He did funny voices. It was these things. They stick with you. On a slight different note, Adam and I are engaged in professional development book writing at the moment, and I think I say I think I've got it in front of me. No point me pretending like I memorised your book. It's here. So chapter 13, your leading professional development of teaching. We touched on that slightly when you were talking about kind of ECTs and stuff. How important is it? It's a self-answering question, but in your mind, when we have professional development of reading and English across a school, sometimes it's reactionary. The old bill are coming in. Do we have reading for pleasure? Have we got a reading mountain? Is everybody reading? Everybody got their books, all that kind of stuff. They haven't got the structured reading lessons, and you've got leaders panicking, which is I say it's natural. It's a regular occurrence, right? How important is it that a school has a separate professional development for the teaching of reading? I guess in any setting, I'm sat here thinking now, I hope none of my teachers are listening, because they're going to be like, he's got a new book, he's done a podcast, things are about to change again. Just got these little mini projects. How important is it that, I mean, your 3 chapters on professional development go quite deeply into how it is important, but just hearing from you now, I think is key.
Yeah, so one thing that is quite common when I speak to schools is you find that they've drifted into a way of teaching reading, or someone read a blog or whatever it might be, and then it was like, yeah, we're going to do that now. And when, even if the teachers are kind of bought into it now, when you find out a bit more about it, there wasn't really often any discussion of the purposes behind moving away from, say, carousel reading to the teaching of comprehension skills or whatever it might be. So often there isn't that underlying understanding of why they might have made changes, and often that's just because it isn't, or sometimes it's because that isn't there amongst the school's leadership team. Or just as often people will say to me things like, oh, well, we do this this way now, but the reason we rolled it out, I'm not really sure, because it was, Heather who rolled that out, and she's now a head teacher down at school down the road. So you'd have to ask her. And you think, well, no, it's your reading curriculum. I need to ask you. So schools having an understanding of, why they want to change reading, what they want to achieve from it, and how it aligns with a shared understanding of reading, I think is really important. So the 3 chapters you mentioned there. So I do talk about professional development and implementation, and then I talk about in practice, like in kind of slightly more general terms, and then I talk about, okay, what are those 2 things looking at like in combination if you want to change reading across the school in the way that I describe. And a lot of it borrows from good ideas from the EEF's implementation guidance, but also most of it comes from me having done this stuff with schools. And so often, if I was to give one bit of advice, I'll end up giving much more than that. I apologize for that. But if I were to give one bit of advice, it's that very often schools will end up doing one thing or the other. They'll either say, okay, well, I want teachers to understand the theory behind reading. I want them to have a basic grasp of the evidence, the nature of the English writing system and what that means for the teaching of reading. I want them to understand what fluency is, et cetera, et cetera. I want them to have a really good grasp of reading. And then there's nothing that follows that. So there's once you've got that grasp of reading, that might have implications for how we teach reading, because that is a priority at the moment. And so you end up sometimes just with this theoretical bit. Or equally, the other side, where a school say, we want to change how we teach reading, we want to move to X, Y, and Z. And I'll often say, well, actually, we need to slow down a little bit, because if your staff don't understand why you're doing this, then it isn't going to fly. And even if they do if you want them to understand why you're doing it, then again, you need that theoretical underpinning to begin with. So you can't really separate out the 2 things. You have to support teachers to have a really good grasp of what reading is, how it develops, and what research and the accumulated wisdom of the profession suggest about how we can best facilitate that development. You need that stuff. But then you also need a reason to have learned that. You need to then go, now that we've learned that kind of supports why we might make changes to how we teach reading. And again, that doesn't have to align exactly with what I advocate, regardless of what you're doing. If you're making changes in reading or mathematics or geography or history or whatever, if you're not connecting that to, well, what's the rationale behind this? What's our shared understanding of this subject and aspects of how it can be taught that lead into that, then you're not kind of building on solid foundations.
Do you know what comes up a million times when people talk about professional development as well is like people put tons and tons of work into sequences of PD. So like, right, reading is our priority this half term. We're gonna absolutely nail it. We're gonna put loads of effort into it, and then it gets to the end of half term, and it's like, and on to the next thing. One of the biggest challenges is, how do you keep it relevant after you've delivered that initial big hit even if it's not just one session, if it's like a sequence of sessions, and maybe you've got a great coaching program as well, and you've used that as an implementation tool for what you're learning about in whole school PD as well. How do you then keep it relevant? And we'll come to you for any top tips you've got on that in a moment, Chris, but I would say in my experience, it's think about what you mean by the word monitoring.
Yeah. Because
monitoring is something that goes on and on and on all the way through the year. If you kind of take monitoring as being check everybody's doing it right, I think you're always going to end up being disappointed, because monitoring's then not going to actually work for you. If you're taking monitoring as being, let's go out and find out what's actually going on in classrooms, without any sort of blame or judgment or inference attached to what happens if I don't see what I'd like to see, because it makes me feel good that I'm seeing what I think I want to see because I'm the one that did the professional development. If we're going into classrooms going, what is actually happening, and then let's find out are there any typicalities? So, for example, if we're going in and seeing, okay, close reading's looking great, extended reading's looking great, but fluency reading, that's not quite where it needs to be, then you just circle back and just do some more on that. But your monitoring needs to be looking at typicalities, not looking at the perceived competence of any particular teacher at doing the thing you want them to do. I think if people use monitoring that way, you will keep change relevant rather than letting it become transient.
Kill it. Yeah.
And they monitor at the wrong moments. I think, at least when we're thinking about something specific like reading lesson structures. So one thing I really like to do when I'm working with schools is to say, okay, now we've talked about this and I've kind of shown you the basics of how to do this. What I'd like you to do is the next couple of weeks, go and try this in your classroom and experiment with it. See how it feels, see how you get on, how you feel about the routines, what the drawbacks are, what makes it difficult in your class, what bits you like about it. And maybe this is a bit controversial, but I think for those first few times that teachers are having a go at it, I think it's better for them no one to be watching and giving advice, etc., because they're just getting to grips with it at that point. And often they'll make really big strides on making sense of it on their own from getting a feel with it. And inevitably, if someone is in there, it doesn't matter if it's your best mate and they've never said anything negative about your teaching, you aren't going to experiment with it in the same way if someone's watching you. And unfortunately, that's when often people want to watch. It's like, okay, I've said we're going to do this thing. You're going to do it in the classroom. I'll see you next week. And actually, I want some time for teachers to just play with it, just to feel their way around it, and then to give us some feedback on how did it go, what did you think about X, Y, and Z. And then down the line, once teachers are a bit more comfortable with it, then yes, support, monitoring, coaching if that's a mechanism you use in your school, etc. But the short version is that you can't just forget about it. You can't just roll something out really quickly and then leave it. It sounds really obvious, but the two big problems that go wrong with at least the professional development that I experienced when I was still a classroom teacher, the two major problems was, first, there wasn't enough clarity about what it was meant to look like, what it was meant to feel like in the first place. That was always a big problem. So I go back to the classroom and I think, what does this actually look like? And it had never been specified what the key ingredients were, what stuff needed to be in there, what stuff was superficial and could be nudged around to meet the needs of my class and me as a teacher. So it was like, that's number one problem, or one out of two big problems. One of them, not a great deal of clarity on what it's meant to look like, what planning looks like, etc., etc. But the second, which relates more to what we've been talking about, is the tendency of school leaders to roll something out, have a good look at it, and then do this, and then just kind of like look away, just ignore it, just go, well, I'm sure it's fine, because that's the bit that hurts. As a school leader, it doesn't matter how brilliant your professional development is and how wonderful your teaching staff are, etc., etc., etc. If you roll something out, it is not going to look exactly the way you wanted it to when you first start to go and look at it. It's going to take a big old bite out of your ego. You're going to have to adapt. But that painful, ego-sapping work of genuinely engaging with teachers where they're at and how they are genuinely feeling about this new thing, that's what makes stuff work. If you're not willing to do that, and I've worked with lots of school leaders that haven't been willing to do that, and a few that really have. And the difference between the way that they change schools is night and day. That willingness to have your ego damaged again and again by going back again and again to see your teachers, to offer support, to actually deal with what it really looks like.
And actually, like, thinking about strategically what you can do to facilitate that. So I think we've kind of got this this traditional approach to professional development, which is that it happens in this one big block per week. Well, actually, what if you were to just shave a little bit off that, and you go, okay, so we've still got this bigger block, and that's where we're going to do our main sort of piece of professional development each week. But then we've got this other 20-minute block. Maybe that's what we're actually going to use this Friday morning briefing for, because it'd be more effective than what a lot of schools use Friday morning briefings for. And actually, in that Friday morning briefing, whatever our previous PD focus was, that's what our SLT drop-ins or our subject leader drop-ins have been on. And this little 20-minute bit, this is going to be our time to feedback about that and talk about that and run rehearsal on it if that's what you want to do. But it's that thing of just, we know it's not going to be perfect. We know it's a continuous work in progress. And the fact that we've put aside this little bit of time, it sends a message that we accept that that's the case. And what we're asking for is for us just to continually revisit and keep thinking about this stuff all of the time. Again, it's a strategic way of helping people keep change relevant, rather than just, like you say, looking away and hoping that because we did that session, like you say, I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah.
And the thing is, sorry, go on,
Sorry,
Chris.
I was just very, very quickly going to say, like, we always have to keep coming back to the young people. They're the people who, through their teachers, are going to have this constant carousel of, oh, we're doing this now, no, we're doing this now, and actually, you know, they're the ones who might not necessarily have the adult mechanisms to be able to cope with all those changes, because the further away we get from the classroom, I strongly believe in teaching head teachers. I'm very, very lucky to work in a small school, which means that is what I do as deputy. My head teacher teaches. We teach at least one of the classes in the school. I think it's important. I don't think it's practical in big schools, but we keep our feet on the ground. We understand what's going on, so we can miss out a little bit of that going around monitoring, because we're seeing it. Certainly when they come into our GCSE and A-level classes, and we can see the gaps, we know what to do. But I think, you know, our last old bill inspection, she said, do your kids read widely? She said, no. But are they, subjective is the wrong phrase, Monday evening, are they, do they have access to a wide range of books through the curriculum, through the books you've chosen? Absolutely, which is why I'm going to say, yes, they do read widely and wildly, some of them. It's that kind of agentic attitude we need from our inspectors, from our leaders, and just kind of going, I'm going to go into the classroom and go, speak to the kids. Do you enjoy this? No, not a problem. They're not coming out of the classroom and go, well, they didn't like that book, so you're failing. Because that's not the point. Jen Webb said on Twitter recently, you know, sometimes you've got to read things that make you feel uncomfortable. You've got to read things, particularly for older students, you've got to read things that put you in the position that are going to make you feel unsafe and make you think about things and experiences you aren't going to have. And I think, for me, the thing that just triggered that off, as you two were talking, was, yeah, we can go around and we're meeting our teachers and we're having our 20-minute PDs and 50-minute PDs here, but getting into the classroom, getting a feel for that room and getting a feel for what the young people are doing means that when we do get inspected, we're in a stronger position to defend it and turn around to them and go, no, actually, they read widely and they read in a variety of ways. Are any of them any good at it? Possibly not. Are any of them enjoying it? Also possibly not, but it's happening. And look at, as we were talking about earlier, look at these social outcomes, or look at these exam results if that's what you're doing. But you've got to keep close to the ground. You've got, or the sky, depending on where you want to put the young people. You've got to keep close to them. You've got to be close to them, for me. And I know I speak from a position of privilege, but I believe it's something we should all work towards. And you need, if you want to get a member of SLT who just goes, I'm doing it, I'm going to go into the class, I'm going to see. I just think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, and linked to that, I mean, if, for example, you know, you work at a primary school, one of the best things you absolutely can do with any kind of professional development, I think, is have a bit of a scout. If you're going to be demanding change of pupils, you and someone else, it's a really good idea for you to be having a go at this first. Like, if you're going to say to your staff, this is the way that we want to teach reading, it's much more likely to persuade if you can say, I've been doing it in my classroom for the last 2 or 3 months, and when it comes to the professional development that we deliver and we learn about this together, I'm going to show you bits of it. And crucially, when I show you bits of it, you're not going to come away going, wow, that's impressive. You're going to come away going, oh, is that it? I can do that. Because that's what you want as a teacher. You want to see it modeled, to be really clear about it. And that's much easier to do if initially you've got whoever is leading that change, be it, you know, your reading lead, whoever it might be, has actually, they and someone else have kind of experimented with it first, because then you can speak from a position of experience rather than, well, we're all taking this journey together and we hope it's going to work. I know that's not always possible, but it is an ideal. And just very briefly to speak to Adam's point about how we can structure this professional development so it doesn't feel rushed and so it doesn't get lost in other priorities. I think it's really important to stagger this stuff. So when I work with schools, I will talk about the theory and that kind of stuff, and that's often where I'll begin. But when I'm working with them on the reading lesson structures, I will very often be working with them online. And when we do that, it will be, okay, we're going to look at this for this hour, and then you're going to go away, experiment with it, and you'll feed back to your leadership team and to me, and we'll talk about how it's gone. And then a few weeks from now, then we'll look at the next one. And intentionally staggering those things, as well as making it less overwhelming, it kind of signals to teachers that this isn't just a quick fix because Ofsted are coming in, but that this is something we care about and that we're devoting time to. And part of that is being brave enough then to say, okay, I know right now that as equal history isn't where I'd quite like it to be, or mathematics teaching isn't quite where I'd like it to be. But on this occasion, we've chosen reading as our priority. And I know that teachers are trying something new on a, at least a weekly basis for the next 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. I don't want to throw anything else at them. I don't want to say, okay, let's talk about how we use manipulatives in mathematics or how we use sources in history or whatever it might be. That's just going to have to wait if I really want whatever, in this case, professional development relating to reading and this implementation of a new way of teaching reading. If I want that to land, I have to really bear that in mind.
Chris, do we have time for one more question? I've got one burning.
You know me, I'll be here till midnight if you like. Talking about reading and anything you like, go for it.
Okay, so in terms of selecting the books that go into your reading curriculum, is there a rationale that you've come across or a rationale that you promote that you think actually that is like the soundest rationale for why you'd choose those books? And as a suggestion to that, particularly, would love your comments on this. What about this idea of getting together like a set of literary themes that you particularly value as a school? Going, okay, this for our context, these themes are the ones that we want to continually draw out year upon year upon year, in the same way that you might draw out the theme of or the concept of monarchy in your history curriculum year upon year upon year. If you had the concept of I can't think of one off the top of my head for English, but a literary theme that you would want to continually draw out, something like vulnerability, something, what do you think about the idea of planning the actual books that you're going to include in your curriculum around those themes? So those themes are strategically revisited year on year.
I mean, it's a really good question. I would say that if a school did that, I wouldn't see it as problematic in the slightest. So that's the first thing I'd say. I don't think it's bad. It's a bad idea at all. I think there's lots of good idea. I think there's lots of good that can be achieved through that. That said, I would say that there are so much. I mean, with history, you've got the history curriculum, geography curriculum, maths, etc. With reading, even within an area like literature, within your narrative literature, even within that, there is such diversity of things that you could look at. There's such a massive breadth that you are always onto a bit of a loser if you are hoping to cover everything and say, okay, these are the things I want to cover. There's always going to be something that you miss out on. I don't think it's problematic in the slightest to have those themes. And I think it might be quite nice. What I would say is that more broadly, I don't think there is a tried and tested formula that you can apply to building a reading curriculum. But I do think there are some best bets that might align with this idea of themes. I think what really matters more than anything, and again, you might use these themes as a way to ensure you're achieving what I'm about to suggest. I think what really matters is that pupils are experiencing variety. So variety of language, variety of perspectives, variety of kind of literary standpoints. I think if, for example, take, for example, whether pupils are reading stories set in the past tense or the present tense. I think it's a missed opportunity if every story they read is if the tense is the past tense. There isn't kind of that first person narrative, that present tense narrative. Equally, first person and third person writing. Equally, are they reading stories that have certain kind of an emotional feel to them? I don't think it's problematic at all if you, for example, said, oh, okay, we've looked at the selection of stories that we've got so far, and we see that actually this story has a redemption arc in it. This story is all about someone who started out as a real negative character, kind of, turning it all around and winning the day, and then going, actually, we do that here, here, and here. And by making that clear to teachers, they can actually have richer conversations with pupils. They can say things like, when they're teaching wholes, they might talk about a story for earlier on and say, like, oh, do you remember when you learned this story and we learned about that? There are some similarities here. So I think what matters less is whether or not you are, organizing it around certain genres or certain themes or whatever it might be. I think what matters is that once you've chosen that variety, so variety of content, language, and perspectives, once you've got that variety, I do think it's really valuable to then say, well, actually, there are some patterns we can pick out here. I can say, well, this is a novel set in the Victorian era, and we've got another one of those. So it's worth reminding teachers when they read when they're reading the second one with kids that we've got another book that has a similar thing. You can draw those connections across your curriculum, whether that's around themes or whatever else it might be. I think that's a good thing. But in short, if you're saying to me, how do you build a reading curriculum, in effect, I think a very sensible rule of thumb, at least at primary level, that around 50% of the reading that pupils do, maybe a bit more than that, should be, narrative fiction. Just because of how engaging it is, the pacey, wonderful experiences that you can have with that stuff that really seems to excite kids. I think then the other kind of roughly 50%, or maybe a little bit less, should be all other kinds of books that aren't kind of your classic storybook type. So things like myths and poetry and information texts and biographies and speeches, etc. Now, the first part, those storybooks are, I think you can, as it's a sort of thing that as an English lead or a leadership team, you can sit down and plot it out and decide what you're going to buy and get in the whole class sets of texts. And that can be done in a relatively short space of time. You can think about that for this year and have that ready for the next. And over time, of course, you might still adapt that. You might after 2 or 3 years say, that book isn't working in year 6. We're going to take that out, add them to our, just to our reading corners, and we're going to bring this book in. Relatively minor investment to do that every now and then. What's more challenging is the rest of the reading curriculum. It is the poetry, the newspaper articles, the myths, the information texts. That stuff is more about accumulating things over time. You maybe use a text that matches into your history curriculum and go, oh, wow, that worked really nicely. And that actually made it really easy for kids to learn about X, Y, and Z. I'm going to save that on the shared drive for whoever's going to be teaching this year group next year. I think there's more of a gradual accumulation of that stuff. But I think a roughly 50-50 split between those class sets of storybooks and everything else is really important. I think a diversity of language, content, and perspectives, and just aiming to offer as broad a range of those as you can. And I talk about in the chapter in my book about building a reading curriculum, about the sort of things that you might want to bear in mind, like, first and third person, past tense, present tense, whether it's, relatively archaic language, whether you're looking at certain kinds of character arcs, etc. But to be perfectly honest, as long as you've got that sense that you've got those books together and you think, yeah, there's a really good variety of protagonists, themes, etc., I don't think you can go far wrong. It's perfectly possible that 2 schools could not have any overlap whatsoever in the books they read. That could have a completely set of books to the one down the road, and they still be really brilliant reading curricula. I think the most important thing really is to think about that variety and to make sure that pupils are getting experiences with whole text.
Can I just say, we've just had a comment, very exciting, from Chris Baker, who's just said, wow, what a great event. As a secondary PE teacher turned head of Trust PD, I feel like my knowledge of effective reading has just gone through the roof. Thanks, guys. Well, it's lovely. Thanks for tuning in, Chris. And I've got to say, I feel like I'm on slightly the other side with being mostly a secondary school. Hearing you say that is really pleasing to me on a selfish level, because that's how we have recently restructured our English, so that young people in we call them the quavers, what a music school, people in our younger years learn about ambition and supernatural forces and redemptive arcs in this book, this text. And then by the time they hit me with year 10 and I go, speaking of redemptive arcs in the Victorian time with supernatural forces, Here's a Christmas Carol, and we're only about 2 years in, but just turning that on its head slightly, we're already starting to see people being able to make the connections and speaking more to author craft, speaking because they've done the previous reading, and you can see that coming through, and you pick up a little smile, and you kind of go, I think it's working. I think we might be onto something here. And I wrote an article recently. My sense of time is appalling. Not recently, a while ago, which was it was for test based. It was a bit of a shout out, really, to primary schools and secondary schools feeders to talk more, and secondary schools to let the primary schools know what they're struggling, where the gaps are. This, by the way, when they're 15, we're going to be learning about this book. Can we have a bit of a trickle down? Is there any way that we can be having these conversations, because they have no idea what this is by the time they get to us? And of course, some people are like, wow, workload. But I think from a concept point of view, and building a structure where young people can literally just glide through and they're helped through because it's been sequenced and thought through, is, I think it's priceless and really worth, as you've said a couple of times today, the investment and the time and the thought from everybody.
One of the things to bear in mind there is, I think, as if you are, as a secondary English teacher, though you say you've got kind of 5, 6 as well, naturally you will have a grasp of all of the books that you will teach across that reading curriculum, all the poetry and whatever else it might be. You'll have a grasp of all of those texts. And what will often happen in primary education is, even once a reading curriculum has been crafted, it will then be that teachers know about the book in their year group. And if you've gone to that effort, I think it can be really valuable to have a professional development session or two where you just sit down and say, this is our reading curriculum. This is how it's been crafted. These are the books that are contained within it. This is the basic summary of the plot of all of them. You can get a sense of how we've structured this for a sense of variety. You can see how some of these books will connect together, and this book here doesn't really connect to any other book. We just love it. That's just having that broader grasp of the curriculum means then that teachers can have slightly richer, more informed discussions about books with the pupils in their school once they've kind of had that journey. Because obviously, if you implement it in 1 year, the kids who are in year 4 might not have read the books you were expecting them to have done in year 3. But over time, they will have had that kind of more consistent journey. And you can, I think the only thing I would say linked to that is, once schools have built a reading curriculum, and something I recommend in the book, it is valuable, as you've described, to say, okay, along these, what interesting language conventions are followed or not followed in this book? What themes play out, etc. And just making a note of that for each book. Not in a huge amount of detail, not in a way that's overwhelming to create, but just so that when a teacher picks up, there's a boy in the girls' bathroom, and, they can know to themselves, oh, okay, yes, so there is a bit of a redemptive arc for this character. And there is, we see a key theme of this story is the way that we can reinvent ourselves through the power of new relationships, or whatever it might be, and being able to make a note from your knowledge of that curriculum that, oh, well, yeah, actually, we see that theme play out here, here, and here. So, yeah, I do think there's real value, once that curriculum has been constructed, to share it with teachers, to really explain where it's come from. And dare I say, even better, involve them in the process from the beginning, so that you are taking full advantage of that wealth of understanding and experience about children's books that they can bring to the table as a team. So, yeah, building a reading curriculum, it's a really complex thing, but once you take the time to do it, I think it can be transformative.
No, we're engaged in a 2-year project at the moment with Greenwich University, and we're kind of looking at creating. We've got a reading curriculum at the moment that we're really happy with. We have kind of got this hunch that there's more we can do around making connections across year groups, within year groups, around the text that kids are that kids are reading. So we're kind of reviewing the whole thing, but through this lens of connection. And yeah, like I say, we're looking at it being like a 2-year research project. This year being the first year, and then into next year as well. But yeah, I'm convinced that there is something in it. I think you're absolutely right about it. Probably shouldn't be the driver. So choosing a text just because of the theme shouldn't be the driver. It should be about that diversity and that variety. But if you can then go back and map that out, which I think is easier to do if you are reading more whole books as well, because obviously if you're reading a whole book, there's more than one theme that you're able to pull out, and so therefore more than one connection you're able to make. If you're able to then record those connections, happy days.
And just something to note there, I mean, what a great position to be in, because once you've got that reading curriculum in place, once you're comfortable with the way that reading is taught, you're already in a situation where potentially you're doing things much better than the vast majority of schools. And then there's that luxury in saying, well, actually, we're quite comfortable with this. But there is room for like the cherry on the cake here. There's room for us to make teachers' lives a little bit easier in constructing these really rich questions around texts. Over time, you might even start to say things like, well, I did this close reading lesson last week with this text, and wow, was it good. I'm going to save these questions that I asked of kids to the shared drive, and I might even make a note of this question that a kid's asked as a follow-up. And so that over time, teachers are coming to this stuff with this gradual accumulation of like institutional knowledge that you've got about this reading curriculum, rather than it being just the case of, okay, I'm picking something up off Twinkle, which is obviously the worst end of the spectrum. But even like when you're at the start of your journey here, where you've just created a reading curriculum, you might not have that shared knowledge of the texts that you've got across your school. But 2 or 3 years down the line, you can start to do the sort of things you're describing here, which are really, pretty impressive.
Well,
it's going to be good fun.
Chris, I've got to say, I mean, at the moment, over on X, over on Twitter, we've got 82 people who've been watching us now for about 45 minutes to an hour. It's been, and I think if it were me, I'd just be like this. I'd be agog and aghast, and so that's probably why we haven't had many questions come in. But so the podcast, it's gone out live tonight. It'll stay on the platform, so it can be retweeted out, and then I think tomorrow morning it'll come out as a podcast all over the world, where everyone can get it. Are there any closing comments you think? I mean, we've had a good hour and a half, but this is what happens when you get 3 English enthusiasts together on a podcast. We knew it was going to be like this. Is there anything, some headlines you'd like to wrap up with?
If you're directing that at me,
I absolutely am.
Obviously, if you'll excuse the plug, we've been talking about my book, Primary Reading Simplified. There's loads of stuff that we haven't had time to talk about, inevitably, that is in that book. Things like, how do we assess and address reading difficulties, develop spoken language across the curriculum, ensure that our phonics teaching is effective, make the most of one-to-one reading, actually prepare pupils for, things like SATs and secondary school in a way that's meaningful to them and effective, rather than what currently goes on, how we collaborate with parents and carers. All of that stuff is, I like to think that every practical question that a classroom teacher or school leader might want addressing is addressed in the book. I guess if I was to leave people with one message, it's that have a look at the teaching of reading in your school, and just with one lens for the moment, which is how much reading is going on. And is that reading purposeful? Like, is it happening for the reasons that author has created that text for? At least sometimes. And if it isn't, consider maybe over the longer term whether a change might be a good idea. So there's that. Oh, and also feel free to, if you have any questions ever, just reach out to me on Twitter or Blue Sky. It's at Suchmo83. I always reply. And sometimes you'll have to forgive me. I reply with an essay if it's a really good question. So get in touch. I'd love to learn from you and to share any advice that I can, on the off chance that it might be useful.
Well, I mean, you say that. Let's put that up. There you are. There it is. Ta-da! The world can see. Adam, I've learnt new skills. Look at that.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you afterwards about these little banners that keep on appearing on the screen.
And also this. Yeah, enough of that. This isn't Radio 4 at midnight. Chris, your book, I mean, you have looked at it yourself, but I will plug it again. Primary Reading Simplified. If you're watching the podcast, it's there, backwards. It's got a great front cover. Your Twitter is full of it. I've got to say, if I ever see you reply to a thread and it's a thread in and of itself, I bookmark it and I come back to it later with a cup of tea and a pad and pen, because I know that what is going to come out is important and I'm going to need some thinking space. Chris, you are an absolute bright light of clarity and generosity out in the education sphere. And when Adam and I were planning EduPulse's kind of second year of who we might like to have on the podcast, and we had a bit of a wish list, so I gave Adam a wish list and you were on that wish list, and he said, leave it with me, son, and you're you're one of the first. So thank you so much for coming on and absolutely plugging your book, which, as I said at the beginning, anybody, expert or novice, can open this book at a page that shouts to them, and there are retrieval tasks, there are deeper professional development questions, it's fully referenced, it's genuinely brilliant, and the sector is going to thank you for. I think Tom Sherrington even said on X a couple of days ago that this is seminal. It feels seminal. It feels important, and I think that's quite rare sometimes when you pick up a book and go, this is the thing that's going to change things, and I get that sense from this book. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Well,
I think as well, it goes without saying, but like it should be said as well. The generosity to give us and everyone that's listening an hour and a half of your time at 7:30 to 9 o'clock on a Monday night is super generous. So thank you so much for your time, Chris. It's been an absolute education.
Oh, well, please, it's been my pleasure, really. I mean, if people listening don't get the sense that I love the sound of my own voice then already, so then they will have by now. So, yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Will you come back on? Because I think there's more that we can definitely do a part 2.
I'd love to. I genuinely love to.
I'm convinced, because there are going to be people out there going, yeah, but how do I do this and how do I do that? And I think, because the reason why I say that is our numbers are going up. We're nearly at 90. We're saying goodbye and people are still tuning in. Like I said, for anybody who has just joined in, this live podcast version with a visualized podcast will be on Twitter forever. So you can retweet that, and I'm sure Chris will retweet that when we come off air, but it'll go out on Spotify and Apple and all those other podcast things tomorrow morning as well. Sorry, Adam, love, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, it's a bit like when you get to the end of a first date and you go, shall we go out again? And you're never sure, you're not sure, but he said yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. Message me. I'll do that thing where I pause. I'll leave it for a couple of days, then get back to you. Like, oh yeah, why not?
Oh God, this is like the podcast version of leaning in for a kiss, and we've gone for the cheek. We've gone for a cheek. We've gone for a cheek.
We'll have a virtual hug and see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you to everybody listening out there at the EduPulse live audience. It's me and Adam. We're EduPulse, and we try and keep our fingers on the pulse. But listen, we work in schools, so sometimes that pulse skips a beat because we're a little bit busy. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to the latest episode of the EduPulse podcast. Why not help broaden the conversation and join us over on social media at EduPulseCo, or sign up to our newsletter at edupulse.co, and we'll see you next time.